Morning and welcome to the third and final installment of our series, ILC Management in the COVID-19 Era. Today's topic will be remote staff supervision. My name is Ron Kermani and it's a pleasure to be with you this morning. As background, I'm a recovering newspaper reporter, having worked 12 years as the chief investigative reporter for the Albany Times-Union newspaper. I spent the next 35 years in executive public relations positions, first as the PR director for the State Public Employees Federation, then as PR director for the New York State Trial Lawyers Association, then over to CSCA, the Civil Service Employees Association, as their executive editor, and then finally 8 years in the governor's office as the senior vice president of communication for the New York State Higher Education Services Corporation. And it's a wonderful opportunity to be here with you all today. The content of this series is based on responses to a survey conducted by the New York Association on Independent Living, asking about the challenges that you as ILCA directors and staff have experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic. We also wanted to know how you adapted to operate in the new normal and what support we can provide going forward. We hope this platform serves as a positive resource for all of you to share solutions. Now, just a few housekeeping details before we get started. Closed captions are available for this webinar. You will see a notification in the controls at the top of your screen. Select closed caption. After selecting closed caption, you will see the captioning at the bottom of your screen. Now, to make adjustments to the caption size, click on the arrow next to Stop Start Video and choose Video Settings. Click on Accessibility. Move the slider to adjust the caption size. You may choose small, medium, or large. At the end of the session, everyone will be unmuted so you can pose questions to our speaker and to one another. You may also use the Q&A or chat box at the bottom of your screen, and I will relay your questions to the presenter. Now, joining us today is Donal Conn. He's founding principal of Kaydeross Performance Solutions. With nearly 30 years of experience, Donal has designed and delivered learning programs and talent management services for dozens of the world's largest corporations. He is considered an industry leader in designing and delivering dynamic leadership, organizational development, and B2B sales and marketing programs that transcend borders, language, cultures, and industries. His client list reads like a who's who of some of the most successful companies in the world, ranging from numerous Fortune 500 giants to small startups that have really made it big. Before establishing Kaydeross Performance Solutions, Donal previously held executive positions with multiple global organizations. Most recently, he served as Chief Learning and Talent Officer for Momentive, formerly GE Advanced Materials, which is a multi-billion-dollar engineered materials and chemical manufacturer with operations in 23 countries. Now we'll turn it over to Donal for about 45 minutes, then open it up in the last 20 or 30 minutes for questions and answers. Donal, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Ron. I appreciate the intro, and good morning, everyone. I'm typically speaking in front of large groups and stages of thousands of people. So the past 5 months, I'm getting used to quality time with a webcam in my own home studio. So it's nice to join you from Saratoga Springs today. I'd like to start, and maybe I don't think I have control. There it is. I'd like to start by asking maybe the obvious question that you've heard often, and that is, what's going on here? What is this, the new normal, right? And you hear that term, that cliche, in almost every article and every news report about what's happening in the workplace today. Well, the answer is pretty simple. Right now is clearly we're not in the new normal, we're still in the new abnormal. So in the past 5 months, if you're trying to judge what it's like to work remotely and to lead from your home or from afar, I would argue that it's probably not a fair situation to look at the past 5 months and think that this is what it would be like or will be like in the future leading remotely. And why is that? It's pretty simple. We're still trying to focus on our regular operations and our leadership, but we're also doing two other things. We are looking at crisis management and trying to maintain during all these turbulent times and changing news a semblance of operational function. And then thirdly, the extra challenge of leading remotely. Now, I've owned a company for 12 years that's truly been global and always remote. So I have associates in China and Brazil and Germany, where have you, and we've always worked remotely. But that's a very different situation when your DNA is like that compared to your situations where you have facilities and staff around and you're used to working in person and now you're trying to adapt. So if I were in the past, pre-pandemic, teaching all these topics independently, it would easily be 14 or 18 hours of in-person training for leaders to try to master, or at least a semblance of mastery of some of these skills. We're going to do this in the next half hour to 45 minutes. So I'll keep this at a very high level and try to give you some practical and pragmatic tips on how you can manage some of this. One of the issues we're finding is leading remotely or virtual teams or from afar and leading through crisis are sometimes diametrically opposed. Some of the best practices of leading remote teams happen to be the worst practices for crisis management. So right now things are very complicated because you're not sure if you should turn left or right at the same time. And why is that? Well, remote teams, typically you have lower natural engagement and people feel disconnected. In times of crisis, they're hyper-connected or hyper-engaged. They listen to, as a leader, to your every word and very closely look at every one of your actions and judge those or respond accordingly. Same thing for remote teams. You often are looking at future growth and long-term planning and training. And during crisis, it becomes very much focused on the present and the tactical operations of the day. Remote teams, people want to know more the big picture. And why? Because they feel apart. And again, when I say remote teams, it could be that you as a manager are remote and there are people just separated in locations. They want to know not just the who, what, where, but the why and the big picture of what we're trying to do in the strategy. When it comes to crisis, you focus again on the very much the tactical day-to-day. And then lastly, we want to look at some of the similarities there. So remote teams and crisis management, there are, fortunately, quite a few things that are similar. For example, they crave connection and inclusion. Employees have very low tolerance right now for fluff. And they can smell very quickly, both managers and organizations that are using the cliches and using the standard terms and not being very practical and real and authentic. They're also have much less tolerance for office politics. Now you're seeing something that's happening recently, and I'll talk about this shortly, which is called COVID fatigue. And a lot of that fatigue is coming from you're tired of the change and the turbulent, the tumultuous pace of change, but we're also starting to see those office politics fester a little more and the cracks in the programs we've put in place. And lastly, both remote and crisis teams, you need to focus very much on the results and not the activity. And that will be one of the central themes I'll speak of on how to lead from afar, is focusing on the results, not the activity. So let's go, excuse me. As we've proceeded the past 5 months, we were trying to juggle both these things, remote and crisis. The crisis mode is kind of going away a little. And what's happening is we're getting kind of used to the abnormal and the dysfunction in the workplace. And we're seeing COVID fatigue. And so engagement is decreasing quickly, frustrations are setting in. So how you were managing 3 months ago and 5 months ago are starting to look a little different, and we're trying to still maintain a semblance of a normal procedure and normal workflow, but we're seeing that fatigue setting in, and it's getting harder for managers. So what we're learning, and when you're managed from afar, and especially when you have displaced and remote teams, certainly managing is much harder. I'll show you some stats on to verify that. Projects are taking longer. Training is harder and tougher. Hiring and certainly onboarding new employees becomes far more complicated. Workers are less connected to each other and to the organization and to the mission. Younger professionals who used to be able to sit or observe other more seasoned colleagues and learn and get up to speed quicker. They're not developing at the same pace. And there are more personal stressors. Sometimes it's not more, it's just over time they feel more extreme. So kids going to school or college, and should they go to school, and financial situations and cracks in relationships and marriages and things like, they're all accumulating to make things harder and harder, and leading remotely challenges that even further. So we do want to look at some best practices for this. It's not just remote leadership, and it's not just leadership or crisis management. All three of these things are kind of swirling around us in a confluence. So what are the best practices we can look at today? Well, some of these, we have to kind of take a step back and look a little bit of organizational and behavioral psychology. And I'm not a big theory guy. I'm not going to talk about this in great length, but it's important to give a little context of how to manage people from afar, from what their mindset is and what's motivating them or not motivating them in the workplace. So way back 50 years ago, there's a model called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Many of you are probably familiar with it from high school and college classes. But let's just review this because it's very relevant in what's happening today. So the model goes like this. All people need to first take care of their survival or their physiology. So we've focused our most base on food and water and air and shelter and all those things. Then we look at the safety, and we've spent a lot of time in the past few months in this mode. So that's the security. Will I have money? Will I have resources? And the safety to continue thriving. Only then can we focus on things like belonging and my relationships with others and my teammates and my coworkers, as well as my family and loved ones. From there, after that sense of connection is built psychologically, then we can focus on ourselves and a little bit for our self-esteem and our status, our freedoms, our religion, things like that. And lastly, Maslow would call it self-actualization. You can focus more on giving back to others as well as knowing who you are completely. The only reason I show you that model is when you look at the past 5 months, we spend an awful lot of time on the base of that model, right? So what's happened? Well, so typically HR folks and certainly managers, you spend most of your time right in the middle, cultivating belonging, a culture, also workflow, understanding your corporate values, your mission, and understanding how you work together productively and cohesively as a team. Well, in the past 5 months, to go back. So, yes, we do some things around safety, of course, traditionally, and also your employee and your benefits and your compensation and all of that. Us managers spend a lot of time there, but mostly, again, the recognition, the team building, the behavioral feedback on performance, things like that. And then we dabble up that triangle on performance reviews, trying to create development plans, training plans, and certainly the overall, the quality of the performance. However, in the past 5 months, things have gotten really weird. So where we are today, go back 5 months ago, we started where everybody, wherever they were in the workplace, went right to the base. All right, so we were focused on, hey, can I get flour or can I get toilet paper, or in some of those food needs, as well as certainly the ability to survive immediately. What happens with this virus, and is it threatening my personal survival? Then society and in the workplace, we spent and are still spending most of our time in what I call safety mode, right? Safety mode being, do I still have a job, and will I get paid, or are the unemployment checks coming in for other folks, or can I afford my rent? Will I get evicted, or will I be able to afford the mortgage? Certainly, what kind of mask should I wear? And where can I get those? But now, all this controversy on who wears masks and who doesn't, and what states mandate those type of stories. And then certainly, my children, if they go back to school, will they be safe? Should I send my daughter to college? Things like that. So most of us and our coworkers and the folks we're trying to manage are really still focused in safety mode. But as managers, we're trying to elevate them also to that next level, which is belonging. And that's where most of our efforts as leaders should be focused right now. And what's that look like? So yes, building a connection or maintaining a connection with the team, certainly maintaining your culture and your values within your organization. And then lastly, looking at the efficiency. It's the job still getting done. That's really the best we can do at this moment as managers, is focus on that middle tier and quell the fears, at least within the workplace, on these safety fears and focus there. We're making a lot of mistakes as managers, trying to do things that we used to always do, but that we're higher up on that triangle, the esteem and self-actualization with performance reviews and training new skills and things like that, where people are just not ready to talk about that yet, and they're not really able to get their mind around that. So let's talk about, instead of best practices, let's flip it around to say, what are some of the common mistakes we're seeing from managers making as we're trying to juggle this crazy times, right? Well, there's a few. First of all, as an organization and certainly as an individual leader, relying only on trickle-down communications. And what I mean by this, for the top of the organization, there needs to be and continue to be more very authentic, very direct communications across the organization, not relying on a former approach where you would have staff meetings with leaders and then they would have staff meetings with a team. But more importantly, when the team leaders then have those team meetings or individual conversations to reinforce a singular message. Be very, very aware of leaders, especially with virtual teams, sending mixed messages or a back channel dissent on what the senior leader said. That in a virtual environment, certainly in a crisis management environment, is wildly toxic to leadership and messaging. When everything is virtual or emails or these type of webinars, these messages become really important not to have back channel interferers. So next, we're seeing what I call the cheerleader or the over positive leader. It's kind of intuitive and in our human nature to think that as a leader, we want to keep morale up and we want to always stay positive. But that grows old quickly, and especially times when we know there's a lot of challenges we're facing. So you need, as a leader, to be balanced and be, the key word is authentic. So yes, certainly remain optimistic and positive and try to keep that team morale in place, but balance that with empathy and realistic knowledge. So the combination of being hopeful and being pragmatic. And many, especially lesser experienced leaders, they just kind of want to rah-rah to keep everyone happy, and that is only one dimension of leadership. The opposite of that is the business as usual manager. We see many people who say, well, listen, I can't control all of the smoke around me right now. So let's just focus on what we've always done to get through this. And there's certainly a place for that, but understand if you're only focused and talk about work, not showing empathy, not listening and building rapport with your employees and your colleagues, then you're going to come across as tone deaf. Another mistake we're seeing often is trying to provide certainty in these wildly uncertain times. We know, employees know that that there is this uncertainty, and very often as leaders we try to quell that, to give use our opinions and speculation as this is what will happen within our organization, what will happen this fall or this winter, or what we plan to do in Q4, everybody knows that nobody really knows what's going to happen. So trying to present your ideas as certainty, it can come across that you're trying to inflate yourself and you have expertise that you probably don't have, and employees really will see right through that as well. That will hinder your credibility. So work meetings, and it could be virtual meetings, it could be your individual calls. Remember, now more than ever, don't work all the time in your work meetings. If you only start your meetings and right away start on the agenda, talk about your metrics or your latest numbers or performance needs or to-do lists, and that's all you talk about, that you'll never have time to build that social interactivity that is essential right now. And especially you being remote or your teams being not in the same place like they typically were, it's incredibly important to have a time to convene socially as well. That could be before meetings, start a meeting and have 10 minutes of small talk, or have open office hours. I've seen some companies basically have virtual coffee rooms where if you just want to talk and small talk with colleagues like you would in a hallway or an elevator, there's a permanent Zoom that is open that people can just drop in and see what's going on and who's there and talk without the managers and things like that. That is really important to have that connection. And let's face it, many times, you'd always have a meeting after the meeting where people said, what do you think of that? Or let's follow up afterward. They're not happening as much right now. So for efficiency and productivity, make sure you build those channels in as well. Only communicating the financials. I don't see this often and the frontline leaders as much as the senior organizational leaders, where every mass communication is, here's where we are, here's the budget, here's our donations or our projected revenue, or in this case, managing budgets for the following quarters. And you only talk about those and not really showing empathy on all the other things that are going on. So while that's essential and important as a leader to manage to that, be very careful to avoid only focusing on that. Again, it comes across as tone deaf. Performance reviews. This is a very sticky situation 5 months in. 3 or 2 months into the pandemic, I would have definitely said, do not do performance reviews right now, even if they're scheduled, because of that triangle. Most of everything a performance review is starting with belonging all the way up to the rest of the gray of that triangle. However, 5 months in, you probably do have cycles that you have to maintain. I would strongly recommend, though, it shouldn't be a traditional performance review, because you shouldn't measure the metrics that you put in place 12 months ago or 6 months ago. Hopefully you've been managing performance and adapting, so it should probably be in real time, maybe less of an annual performance review if you can avoid it, to a monthly check-in or something like that. Psychologically, most of our employees aren't ready to think about where they're going next in their job or how they can do better for the next year. We're focused right now still much more in the present. So keep things short-term goals and short-term management decisions. And then lastly, training. Many organizations thought, well, some people are working from home, or there are some who are overworked or swamped, all the essential workers in the world, but there's others who have a little bit downtime. So this is a good time to put training in place to develop other skills, or other skills rather. They may have had online training or something available, and this was a good time to catch up. Well, that's a terrible decision right now. All training should be very much focused on the job at hand, the skills at hand. Don't worry about employees' long-term development for their next job, focused on maintaining. We're still in a situation until what the new abnormal becomes normal, where you can't think long-term like that. You should focus only on the training that's relevant to execute their positions right now. So it should be custom to the organization and meet the organization's needs, not these generic trainings. So if that's where we are juggling these three things, let's take a look at on a little bit bigger picture and where we are in the workplace for some practical tips. So before the virus hit, right? So let's go back to really the beginning of this year and early Q1, the stats for virtual teams and remote workers and remote leaders, we were slowly, incrementally getting more virtual teams in the workplace. As of a month ago, about 44% of the jobs that were not compatible for remote work at all. And many of the jobs that you have or those people on site would fall into that category. But there's plenty of other jobs that, in fact, 56% of the jobs could be worked remotely. And of that 56%, the vast majority, almost all of them, people are working. So I'm sorry, I clicked a little fast. So 50 out of the 56% are working from home if they can. So before the virus, traditional workers, almost everyone, 80%, wish they could work from home part-time. In fact, about a third of them said that they would be even willing to take a pay cut if they could work from home. And meanwhile, those who were working from home, about a third of them said, you know what, I wish I could go back to the office. So the grass is always greener a little, but in the past 5 months, we've discovered that it's not all that's cracked up to be in some cases. It's especially for managers. Managers are taking the brunt of working remotely the hardest piece. So here's some stats from basically the past 3 months. So the average workday for those working remotely is almost an hour longer than it was. So people are working not only different times of day, so they're working after hours and all that, but they're just working longer because there's no commutes, there's no lunch breaks, things like that. So if you're working remotely, you're working longer in general. But managers, that's another half hour longer yet because they're trying to maintain from afar the regular work and it's harder when you work remotely. The number of meetings have gone up substantially. The number of emails sent exponentially. Average workers are sending 10 more, but then look at how many more the managers are sending. Same thing with emails received. Same thing with email recipients, because you're not having in-person meetings. Everyone's getting copied on everything. So you might not be sending as many, you're only sending a little bit more out, but you're receiving many, many more because everybody wants to loop you in. So it becomes a full-time job just to maintain your email at this point. After hours, you're seeing that people are working late, and especially managers are sending 16.5 more emails after their regular workday. So they're working longer and longer. So what do we do about that? All right. So workers, when you work remotely, and that's you as a manager and also people who aren't in the office, the social connections and the camaraderie is missing. You feel sometimes like a second-class citizen because everyone else is still working together and in the loop, and you're disjointed. You feel certainly less recognized. You feel frustrated on the ability to integrate, and that you used to see that quite a bit just on people who were calling into meetings and everyone else was in the same room and they forget they're on speakerphone. But now it became more pronounced. You passed over for promotion. People working remotely feel like they're passed over from promotions. They have less exposure to the senior team, and then certainly less involved in the strategy of things as well. All right, so enough about what we've been doing. Let's get into some practical tips. One thing I want to point out, though, is right now the future is wildly divided. There's truly becoming a schism of two different sides. What's going to happen in the workplace? You see companies, for example, the Google and Airbnb and Siemens has 150,000 employees. They're selling all their property and they're committing forever as a work anywhere company. So you see that trend happening, but then you also see the flip, especially in the past month, where companies were leaning that direction. They're saying, you know what, this is not sustainable. So the Bank of America's, in fact, Amazon is hiring 3,500 more people and building 34 more office locations or warehouses, centers, and they're banking on people working back in person. So where this goes, it's 50-50, and you see very disparate trends there. All right, so a little bit about age in working. And this is very helpful, including for your new hires, but certainly the difference in how you're managing the millennials and
let them out if the nurse is here.
As well as
I don't know where it is right now. Goodbye.
I'm sorry, I'm hearing someone on mute or not on mute. So which generation might you think is the most productive working remotely? And if, your classic age groups there, well, you might expect that millennials and Gen Z are happiest working remotely, and that's actually true. That they grew up in that environment with technology, and they seem to be happy working from a distance or remotely. However, there's another piece of that, which is, all right, who does well working remotely? Yeah, sure, they're happy, but who is thriving? If you look at performance reviews of remote workers, it's just the opposite. In fact, the 50 to 60-year-olds are the ones who work most productively, adapt to change most efficiently in this setting. So if you put this in a different context and you chart these two, satisfaction looks like this, but returns on investment, it looks very different. And the reason is pretty clear, that the skills it takes to work remotely and to work in tumultuous times like this is experience. You've seen this before, and you know how to adapt. So instead of focusing so much on what are your tech skills, and can you use virtual equipment, and can you use technology efficiently, it turns out the most important vital skills for working remotely and managing teams remotely is simply experience, and the time spent in different experiences, and you know how to adapt because you have some sort of base. So leading remote and virtual teams. Now, there's a theory for it, and it's a classic theory that goes way back to the 50s, but it's still it's the simplest management theory I know, and it's really simple. Basically, there's two types, theory X and theory Y. Right? Theory X management is a very authoritarian style, where you go step by step. You do this, and then when you're done, come back and I'll teach you the next step, and you're checking on the performance day-to-day, monitoring the activity of each employee. Theory Y is basically empowerment style. Here's the end result, or here's the behaviors I'm looking for, and then you hold them accountable for those behaviors. Now, very different styles in a different time. I would say use theory X for new employees and theory Y for everyone else. But very often managers, especially when you work remotely and lead remotely, you have a tendency to micromanage, right? Because you feel disjointed, you feel less empowered, and you want to get more involved. But you can't micromanage remotely, and you certainly can't manage by walking around. You have to, despite our comfort level, adopt a theory-wise style. So you have to show more trust, you have to show more empowerment, communicate the expectations, and then hold them accountable for the results, not the activity. Sorry, there's a delay in my slides here. So when you work with the remote teams, there's a couple don'ts and some do's. You certainly want to monitor their time, or you don't want to monitor their time and activity if you can. Now, I recognize hourly versus exempt employees, sometimes you need to some degree, but you want to focus on the results of their performance, not check in perpetually, what did you do the past 10 minutes or 15 minutes? And again, micromanaging is the certain kiss of death for virtual teams. And don't expect no distractions, both people working remotely with kids and children and dogs and daycare and things like that, and working after hours as well. Don't expect them necessarily to perform the duties only during typical times. You saw the stats on how that's just not happening right now. But there's plenty of do's. Certainly creating a communication rhythm, not just across your teams, but individually. Make sure you have a formal rhythm and much more check-ins. I mentioned those drop-in hours, video hours. Set reasonable deadlines, but keep the deadlines more focused on short-term, not deadlines of annual goals as much right now. You do want to define and track metrics and performance if you can. That's in certain jobs, certainly that you're working with. It's harder to do that than if you're a chemical engineer or working in other industries. But it's important that you define what success looks like, what performance looks like, and you try to measure those because you're not there to monitor those. And then schedule time to blow off steam as individuals and as teams. So you see a lot with salary and benefits. Just a couple quick tips here. Certainly, if you're working remotely or you have people who are working remotely, a couple months ago, all the employees were trying to figure out technology and do they need printers and dedicated phones. My suggestion is before you get too much into that, look at your smartphones. Many of these tools are right on there. For example, you have scanners. If you have an iPhone or an Android, you all have scanners that can scan documents into PDFs and email them directly right on your phone. And iPhones, it's in the note function, and you see the screen here. So a lot of this equipment people are buying for remote workers, or you are worried that I don't have the right equipment. Many of that, certainly not printers, but many of that can be done by the phone. You just, there's free apps or low-cost apps that can do some of that. So virtual team communications, we're all living just like right now on webcams very often. And I'm sure many of you in the past few months got to be relative experts on Zoom meetings and WebEx and those type of platforms. So let's talk a little bit more about those. So there's plenty of platforms. There's, I think, 35. They all are variations to the same theme. But here's tips when you're having staff meetings. Even if you are having a small meeting, go around your team and always assign a moderator who's not the facilitator. That leaves you as the manager the ability to communicate. Someone else is worried about taking notes or the chats or sharing files, things like that. If you try to do that both as the facilitator and the moderator, it becomes wildly inefficient. You spend more time with technology than actually the communication. So always assign a moderator, and you can rotate that. All these platforms have whiteboards, just like you would in a meeting room. And to keep these meetings interactive, please, don't hesitate to use those. Taking notes and collaborating, it's not, it can be intimidating to learn that technology, but it's really quite simple. Use those whiteboards and notes just as you would a blackboard or a whiteboard or dry erase board in a meeting room. You certainly want to use breakout rooms, especially for larger meetings. People need to have discussions in small groups, especially when you're talking about strategy or workflow or things like that. So learn how to use the breakout rooms in these platforms as well. I would recommend highly using sharing files. So as you, and that could be collaboratively working on files together, or just if somebody mentions a Word document, instead of sending email later, just put the link right up there in the chat and everyone can, it becomes much more efficient and cuts down on emails later. Use waiting rooms, especially if you're having back-to-back meetings. You see it very often, a 1 hour meeting, 5 minutes before the end, the next meeting folks are coming in. So use waiting rooms, and that way you can learn who's in and out of your active meeting. And lastly, don't schedule meetings back to back. If you're working remotely, the rule of thumb is 45 minutes to an hour is the maximum you ever want to have a web meeting. But what happens with those working remotely, you might have 3 meetings. So each meeting was an hour or less, but you've been on for 4 hours. So try very hard to create at least 15 minute, half hour windows between them if you can. Get up, walk around, because it's just, that's where the fatigue sets in pretty dramatically. And if you're having bandwidth issues in particular, or you're seeing that your software itself is slow, like right now it's a little clunky for us, a lot of times that is because so many Zoom meetings and web meetings are happening. So if you schedule meetings in off-peak times, start instead of at 10 o'clock at 10:08 or something like that, you'll find that the cycle is much quicker because the bandwidth gets dedicated to the start time of the meeting. A few other best practices. Now, actually, you should recognize for those using Zoom or Skype or a few of these platforms, security is becoming a very big risk, more and more every day. A lot of nefarious hacker types are quickly learning how to get into companies' emails and systems through virtual meetings. So use your personal IDs. Don't use your personal IDs, use those meeting IDs that are separate. Certainly keep your personal meeting ID off of things like social media where people can see those. In public meetings, make sure there's registration passwords, things like that, because you're seeing a lot of, sometimes it's just bored college students, and sometimes it's people with criminal intent, but there's more and more of that happening, so be secure with those meeting IDs and passwords. Also, and this meeting is being recorded, you can record your notes in meetings video. That's very helpful for minutes for your meetings, but understand there's kind of a few tricks to that. So it's easy, for example, here on Zoom, you can just record the meeting, the host can do it simply, but understand how that relates to the chat function. So there's two types of chat. There is public chats and private chats. So the host can chat with everyone on the meeting in a public chat, but sometimes a private chat, the host can chat individually as other people are talking, or even have control of the screen individually between members. That's all well and good. You can't see those individual chats on the screen during the meeting, except when you record it. Because if you record it and then send it out as minutes, all those other chats, people were making little comments, I can't believe someone said that, or why is the dog barking, or what little offhand comments that you're chatting back and forth, all get saved. And when it gets saved as a recorded meeting, everybody sees all of those. So there's been I have probably dozens of stories in the past few months of people who thought they were in a private chat in a Zoom meeting, and then the meeting went out to the rest of the team, and they're talking to HR now, right? So those type of meetings. Another tip you could, you probably got Zoom down at this point. Let's talk a little bit more about the messaging, or the medium of the message. And this is critical for you at managing remotely. So you have emails, you can text or instant message, phone calls, video meetings. What you can't do is all the in-person stuff right now. So you lose some of the ability to communicate. And that's actually, you lose more than you probably think. This study's been around for a long time, but it seems counterintuitive, but it's been done by many of the most prestigious universities, the Cambridges and Harvards, and they found the same thing. Over half of your interpersonal communication is nonverbal. So that's how you can play charades or things like that. So your gestures, your eye contact, that is over half of your message and ability to communicate when you're in person. 30% is not even the words you choose, but your vocal inflections and your tone and how loud you are and how much silence you use, things like that. So only 7% of your message when you're in person are actually the words you're choosing. Keep in mind though, in some of these different channels virtually, you lose the ability to do some of these things, right? So if you map it out basically based on those 5 different techniques, in person, you have 100% of those tools. Video calls, you have 72%. You can still see my gestures, my eye contact. You can hear me. You can see if someone on a meeting is rolling their eyes or making a face where you want to do a follow-up question. Telephone, you lose all of that. Certainly text, you lose all the vocal pieces of that. And email is only focused on that 7% of the words. So you're 93% less efficient communicating by using email. Sure enough, that's how most remote managers spend the vast majority of their communication is using email. So if you are having, as a manager, anything that has emotional topics, need to motivate your employees or requires interactive dialogue, go up that chart, in person if you can, for sure, but if not, at least a video call or a telephone call at a minimum. Don't use text or email to communicate emotional information or information that might be volatile, right? The flip is also true. So use things that require documentation, things that you need as reference. That's only then do you want to use those emails. And it's becoming a real epidemic. If you look at emails right now, over 80% of all virtual work is done by email. So a tip for this is please encourage all of your folks to change this. A simple tip, change the subject line. What's happened is you see all these changes where people respond and other people are CC'd in, and you might have 30 emails with the exact same subject line, and people can't refer back or know which email to look like. So as a rule, every time you send an email, update or change that subject line, or at least a version control methodology so you can access those emails later. That adds to the efficiency quite a bit. So if our current state were, it's clearly exposing poor leaders, and because all of these extra challenges, all these extra skills to manage crisis, manage virtually, and then regular management of your operations, you have to be experienced and a well-tuned leader. So it's exposing those who aren't. But it's also, creating a lot of opportunities, certainly for better talent management skills, better talent strategy, communication practices, and a time to redefine training and how you train. Suddenly people are realizing there was a lot of inefficiency and fluff in training, and we need to be very direct and focus only on the job skills. So, there's a lot of that's good that's happening. So basically, if you remember this slide, focus most of your efforts right now on team building and belonging, and less on individual long-term development, more on practical job coaching and job behavior and performance. So with that, I think we're about ready to open up questions with Ron. I do want to offer, after this session, if anyone has individual questions, we may not feel comfortable in a group asking, I'll put my information up here. You're welcome to email me. I'm more than happy to, if I have any guidance or any thoughts, I'm happy to share that as well. So back to you, Ron.
Donal, that was terrific, and what a huge amount of information, very useful day-to-day information that we can put to use in our workplaces. I'm going to open this up now for questions and answers, and everybody in the field who's participating, you have the ability to unmute yourselves and speak. And if you prefer not to speak and ask Donal a question directly, please use either the Q&A box or the chat box. Both are located at the bottom of your screen. Anyone and everyone is welcome to chime in with an answer, a question, a discussion. So please, the floor is yours in the audience, and please type your questions in or unmute yourselves and let's talk. Donal, while we're waiting for questions, it's nice to see that people with experience are the ones who are getting the best performance reviews at this point and are able to weather the storm, so to speak. Did you expect to see that no, folks in their 50s and 60s are the ones most adaptive to this?
Yeah, well, no, that's definitely been a big surprise for all the academics studying this as well, even though intuitively it makes an awful lot of sense. So the school of thought traditionally was younger folks who were entrenched with technology growing up and seemed to embrace a lot of that as their lifestyle would probably thrive in a virtual environment. And so that was kind of the expected thought going in. And certainly they're also very often happiest in that environment. However, again, intuitively, if you don't have the experience to rely on, how are you going to work more independently at home? How are you going to learn from others? It's much harder. And those, if you look at that study a little closer, those in their 30s, and 40s do really well working at home from a productivity standpoint while they're working, but they're often at stages at life, they have young kids or they have other situations where it becomes harder for them just because they're juggling more. So it makes a little more sense when you put in that context that those who are a little bit later in life in their 50s, if they have kids, they might be adult kids now. They are the ones who, they have the experience, they have less distractions, and they have the discipline to focus on work, and they're thriving right now. By the way, there's a lot of studies that have come out that from a hiring practice, a lot of companies It was kind of an unspoken rule there was that anyone in that 50-year-old bracket was overqualified or cost too much money, so they deferred to hire younger folks with less experience and try to cultivate their own leadership within. And those 50-year-old professionals were, it was harder to find a job. And you hear there's been many studies on that. Well, that's come back to bite folks too, because now you have a lot of leaders, maybe they got promoted too early, and we're seeing in times of crisis and where they just didn't have the experience, they weren't ready to be leaders, and these 50-year-olds who had the experience aren't in leadership positions. So it's coming back full circle, and companies are catching on very quickly to that.
Questions from the field, please. Another follow-up, Donald, while we're waiting for questions and comments, please, is it wise for a manager to perhaps promise more vacation time or a bonus or whatever once we get through this morass?
Yeah.
We're working extra time and extra effort.
I've seen that. That's a great question, and I've seen that a lot. Well, I would argue that the most important to take vacation time is actually right now versus later. Now, when we of course have no idea when later is. Is Q4? Is it next year? No one really knows how long we'll be in this situation. But there's a lot of information coming out that because people are working kind of 24/7 right now on their own schedules, especially those working remotely, and because vacations, even though it's summer, aren't truly vacations. People aren't traveling like they used to and all of that. You saw the stats, how people are working so many more hours a week. You're seeing the burnout faster and faster. So you're starting to see companies actually force downtime and vacation time now. And forcing people to step away from the office. You're also seeing this where companies are forcing almost like forced days off and holidays. Now, certain jobs you can't do this, of course, but instead of one person taking a day off this week and another next week, they come back after their vacation to all these emails and they get hit harder. They're realizing, you know what, let's have half the team all take Friday off. So then if they're all taking it off, you don't come back to all this work that strains the efficiency. Now, some companies, some jobs, that's just not practical, of course. But the trend is actually trying to get people to take more vacation time and step away this summer and right now, instead of accruing that time. A lot of people, the strategy is they're trying to save their PTO banks, and they'll have a big a bank later, and it won't be practical everyone to take time off when there is a recovery. Great question.
Other questions, please, folks, from the field. Let's either get on the chat box or the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and type something in. We'll relay them to Donal, and he can go from there. Or unmute yourself and talk to us directly.
Yeah, I'd love to hear some of your real world challenges of, within your own offices and workspace. What are some of the things that you're struggling with? I've heard a lot of questions from a lot of different types of companies. Maybe I have a tip that I can share from one of them.
Right, exactly. I'm just checking the chat, nothing here yet. Okay, I hope everybody's able to do that because we have a world expert here. And do you see, will you be seeing, or do you expect to see a lot more use of the employee assistance programs, the EAPs, in various work sites, because coping with all of this, again, all the stresses you talked about that nobody's used to, what's going to happen down the road in another year in terms of people's mental health?
It's really a disturbing trend because, and again, intuitively, you would expect to see that, right? And you're seeing some of that employee assistance programs for non-work related matters. Sadly, you see, it's hard to get up-to-date stats right now in a lot of ways, but things like domestic violence, things like divorce rates, things like alcoholism, they're all going through the roof. Unfortunately, that doesn't correlate to EAP calls. So it seems like while things are escalating because of all the pressures of our society, we're not seeing people reaching out to that, at least that channel, and looking for help. I would surmise that hopefully that would happen if people are having, more personal crisis. They remember that they can then reach out. Truthfully, if about half of the working population right now is unemployed, they don't have an EAP program. So, and the ones who are working are sometimes working even more. So I think what we're seeing in society is many of the folks who are unemployed are struggling for all of those mental health issues, but they don't have the EAP to use. And that's probably why that stat isn't correlating right now.
Right. Okay. Something to watch for sure.
No
well,
doubt.
everybody, I have one chat comment coming in here. What are the trends for employers compensating employees for using their own devices for work?
Yeah, great question. Had you asked me that 3 months ago, my answer would look different than today, right? So initially, most companies thought, well, we all thought this was only a very short-term temporary thing, right? So we're going to work from home. We'll be back in a month or two tops. And then a few months into that, we're saying, well, you know what? It's still temporary, but it could last a little longer. Now, reality is setting in that we don't know how long this will be. And many companies are starting to realize that even if we have employees come back, they're still going to need some home office equipment because they might be doing job sharing. They might do, come in a couple days a week and work from home a couple days a week, things like that. So the past month, you're seeing a lot more investment. I see companies doing things like just giving a stipend, like Herman Miller gives all their employees $750 to buy office and furniture because they're starting to see ergonomic issues with carpal tunnel syndrome and all of these things. People are working from off their bed in their bedroom on the ironing board because they don't have a desk, things like that. So you're seeing quite a bit on bonuses or extra benefits on things like extra phone lines or especially improved Wi-Fi. The reality check, a lot of folks who have families, I'm one, I have 3 boys, twins who were going to school on Zoom, and a college student who was home, who was going to school, and then my wife and I both working from home. We had 5 people all fighting for bandwidth, and I'm trying to give a keynote, and meanwhile, things are glitching. So had to upgrade Wi-Fi's and routers, and that's the most common one I'm seeing right now is companies saying we'll give you extra money for cell phone use, but especially extra money to upgrade your internet services.
I know we have a question from Ori Mercer, and she's saying, I like your suggestion of starting meetings early to socialize or having scheduled coffee times. Our team is always very social in person, but awkward on Zoom meetings. Any antidote to that? Yeah,
so what I'll do 2 things. And again, I've owned a company, we've done this for a while, but if you have a 45-minute, schedule an hour. In the first 15 minutes, you could do something half or like semi-formal, like do a activity. I've seen a client of mine, they do kind of like a takeoff of MTV Cribs where one person will take their cell phone around their house to show their house in their backyard or things like that, and each person gets highlighted. There's times where you just have open talk like you would if people get there 5 minutes before a meeting and you're making small talk. Sometimes it's social, sometimes it's actually work related, preparing for that meeting. So I often will schedule 15 minutes where the team is there, and as a manager, I'm not, right? So let them talk about whatever they're going to talk about, work or home, and then 15 minutes in, I call in. The other thing I mentioned earlier is have just a open hour where basically there's a Zoom meeting, anyone can talk and call in, and there's no agenda. It's basically, consider it like the lunchroom or break room. Very often people just desperately need contact, and you can just have small talk and talk about your kids or talk about the weather, whatever you're going to talk about, how the Yankees are good and the Red Sox are not this year, whatever you want. But that's important to bond. Now, I'm a Red Sox fan, so it's cut deep, but I digress. It's important to bond as teammates and for efficiency, but also for mental health.
Here's another comment. In my company, we're struggling to find equality. Some people have company laptops while others do not. Now we're being asked to forward company phones to our cell phones and give out our personal contact information. So some of us have established Google Voice numbers to protect our privacy. How do you stop the melding of personal and professional?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, like everyone else, I'm still struggling with that. But you just mentioned a great tip, and that's Google Voice. So there, in the beginning, there was this great disparity on software and equipment, right? So the equipment is a tough one because some had laptops, some didn't. Some have antiquated laptops and things like that. That's a harder one to fix without just a CapEx expenditure to buy people new equipment. But the software is much easier. I do highly recommend that you use personal lines and there's the grasshoppers and Google Voices and all that where you can bounce your lines. Initially, companies were trying to get a second dedicated cell phone and things like that. And it didn't make a lot of sense because most people, it's better just to give a little bit of money towards the bill and get one of those add-on services. Google Voice is free. You can just have your calls. There's a lot of services. I mentioned Grasshopper, but there's others that will have, it's kind of nice because you can have voicemails that go to work and they get transcribed as emails to you, and they're a couple dollars a month. So there's lots of software to help with that.
Good to know. Donald, another question from Maria Dibble. She's saying we have weekly staff meetings and now via conference call, and it is very difficult to get people to engage and make comments. I haven't been able to get people to talk as much as they used to at meetings. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I have a couple. And one is there's a concept of communication called push versus pull, right? So push being you're giving information, you're lecturing, you're presenting new information. Pulling is from them, where you're asking questions and facilitating, getting that group thought. So part of it is your facilitation style. Instead of saying, we need to do ABC, right? You can actually open it up to the group and say, what do you think our priorities are? And then you can redirect them. So you have those group discussions right up front. So pull first, get the team to make suggestions. And then of course you can correct or verify or redirect as your management needs to be. So very often if you're having trouble engaging, it's because you're probably starting by pushing and lecturing first. The other is, and I mentioned within Zoom, it's amazing. I saw a recent stat, actually it wasn't Zoom, it was Adobe Connect, but one of these platforms that how little polling, how little whiteboards, and how little the group chats are used in these Zoom type meetings. So you can, depending how big your team is, you can break them up into those little breakup groups and have their own talks, but then also ask questions and poll them. So even if they're not openly communicating because the dog is barking, they're on mute or whatever, if you have a poll question, they can at least anonymously answer your question that way. And that's a helpful way to at least get the dialogue started.
Good point, good point. Christina Curry has this comment also. Sometimes the Brady Bunch Zoom-style staff meeting can be exhausting.
Totally.
With the ASL, interpreters, captioning, and asking people to wait and not talk over each other, and facial expressions that indicate disconnect. Staff will complain about the lack of physical presence and not feeling connected. This is our struggle for the past few months. Any ideas or suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, you're not alone, right? What are our options? And if you think about the communication, if not that Zoom, now keep in mind, you don't always have to have your cameras on. It's best when you're having interactive talk, because what you saw before, you see facial expressions, and believe it or not, be thankful that you do see the eye rolls or the people doodling, because then you can at least adapt your messaging. If you're talking to folks without that, you have no ability for feedback. So be careful what you wish for. But I desperately wish, there's some Star Trek teleporter technology. Until that happens, we have text messages, we have emails, we have group chats, we have video conferences. Without the obvious, can we meet in person? There are more and more companies that are having, especially since it's summer, socially distanced staff meetings where everyone brings a lawn chair. I saw one, I live in Saratoga. There was a work meeting in Congress Park. There was 20 people, and they were all 6 feet away, and they brought their own lawn chairs and actually had a work meeting, right? So, it depends on your comfort level and your HR policies and, all your logistics, but it's starting to happen just because people are desperately crave that interaction.
If they can't go to the horse races in Saratoga this month in August, they might as well go to an office meeting. So they're using Congress Park for a good thing. Other messages, questions, comments from the field, folks. Chat box at the bottom or the Q&A box at the bottom, please. Or unmute yourself and chime in. We have one here. Okay. Someone else would like to ask Donal, could you talk more about onboarding?
Yeah, onboarding is it's
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about onboarding new staff.
Sounds like we have someone needs to be put on mute. Onboarding, there's lots of different positions out there, and so it's hard to make sweeping generalizations. But the reality is, onboarding the way you did it, it's not feasible in many ways right now, because of course the first couple months, first couple weeks in particular, that interaction is so essential. I would highly recommend that you assign a buddy or a mentor who's not in your office if possible, or so instead of just the manager or leader primarily leading the onboard, find someone and it's a little more senior, but also at a collegial level, and have them pair up as basically a lifeline. That's becoming essential, and reward that other person, the senior person, somehow for that extra duty. Because when you have cross training, very often a new person won't ask their manager everything. The desk next to them or that they work with, and without the ability, it becomes really very tough. Very often, might want to have 1 or 2 people
available to the floor. 516 trains. M101 limited. M103 and M35. This stop is East 125th Street and Lexington Avenue.
Donal, I think we're on the subway in Manhattan. So
yeah, I hear Lexington Avenue though. That's a busy stop. So
don't miss your stop. Whoever's doing it live there. That's funny. You never know what you're going to get when you go live. Any other questions? We're nearing the end of our session with Donal. We'd love to have more questions. He's available. You have his contact information on the screen in front of you. He is not shy, and he loves questions, and he loves sharing his considerable knowledge. So we have a world-class presenter here with us today, and we'd be happy to entertain some more questions in the last minute or so. So please either chime in person by unmuting yourself, or get on the chat boxes I'm looking at now, and or the Q&A box. So Donal, a minute of final instructions or suggestions for us, please.
Yeah, well, I want to, it probably doesn't go said enough, but the past 5 months, it's been hard on everyone, of course, and all your employees and all of your family members and loved ones in society. But it's worth mentioning that managers, and you saw the stats, are taking the hit more than ever, right? So the extra hours, the extra emails, the juggling. It was hard enough to be a leader 5 months, 6 months ago. right? So, you know, I don't want to browbeat the point, but give yourself a lot more credit and a lot more love, because you are unequivocally in the hardest spot. In HR folks and frontline leaders have a lot on their plate. So you're not going to be perfect, and we're all trying to figure it out together, but take a moment and give yourself credit from where you've come, because I applaud all of you for that extra effort. Organizations aren't always recognizing the frontline leaders for the lion's share of the work that's happening right now.
Good comments, Donal. Thank you all for sharing your best practices today with us. We appreciate your engagement, and also Donal Conn from Kaydeross Performance Solutions. Most of all, we appreciate all you do in our communities across New York State, day after day and year after year. Now, as a reminder, please complete the evaluation form that will be emailed to you. We value your input and encourage your ideas for future programs. We hope you found this webinar series helpful during these trying times. And again, thank you for being with us today. Be safe and be well. Take care.